Hi, my name is Helen, and I am doing my video for Professor Dunn's class. And I decided on my title is going to be graphing. My class is kindergarten students. I'm a sub-teacher, so I really haven't had my own class. But at the end of the school year last year, I did kindergarten. Actually, I did pre-K, but I decided to do kindergarten for this summer class. And my central focus is I can create data to create a bar graph. I picked math because I think it's very motivating and very hands-on. So I figured they would learn a lot because they knew a lot about the animals. So this way they could see what their classmates like more and what they like less. So they have been doing, I introduced sorting and graphing for farm animals. And I read in the Effective Practices in Early Childhood that although reading has received much more attention, research now demonstrates that math skills at kindergarten entry are the strongest prediction of later school achievement and executive functions. And I have 3 Common Core standards for math, and my learning goals and objectives are 1, to describe and compare measurable attributes, and number 2, to classify objects and count the number of objects in each category. So like I said, some of the prior knowledge that they have that we have been discussing and reading about farm. So I say to them, what kind of animals belong on a farm? What kind of animals belong in a barn? What kind of sounds do the animals make? Why do you think it's good to have things organized? Why should things be in a bin? Have you been sorting objects? So they've been doing that throughout the school year. So that is their prior knowledge. I also, the motivation was that we did a lot on the smartboard. We had a video that they love to watch. It was called Grouping of Data. It was by Ken Adu. And also, because I read in the book that music is a great motivation, so there was a little song that the kids sang. It was about, this is why I graph. So that was a lot of fun for them. And the smartboard is very interactive, so there was a big barn, and they could move the animals up and kind of sort in the barn on the smartboard. So that was a lot of fun, and it really got them into the lesson. Before I started the lesson, a question I said was, why do you think it's important to graph and to organize our information? What can we do to get it all organized? And I had shown them before that some graphs that we have. So this was one of the graphs that I made, and we actually had this on the whiteboard. So this was on the whiteboard the whole time, and students came up individually. Each student, I have 24 students, so they came up and they colored in the one that they like the best. So I had that the whole time on the whiteboard. Each student actually had a table. So when we were done graphing, they had a table, and they had to put in next to each animal how many. So then that was easier for them to go and do their individual graph. And here was the individual graph that every student had. So when they went back to their desk, this is what they worked on. Prior to that, before we finished all that, they saw different graphs. We had a whole bunch of different graphs. I actually had a graph for the students that had a little hard time grasping. So they could just use pictures. I had pictures on the bottom, and they could just color in and cut out. They could actually just cut out the pictures and put it on instead of graphing. So some of the vocabulary words that they needed to know were prediction, sounds, graph, higher order, more or less, same, and then the animals. They all knew what type of animals. They all pretty much knew the animals. While we were doing the graph, I asked the questions, why do you think it's important to sort out objects? They would say to keep it organized. Can you predict which animal do you think will have more? Which animal do you think will have less? I had them turn and talk to their fellow classmates before we even did the graph. They turned and talked. They talked about the grouping. They talked about what they thought, if they could make a prediction, what animals would be the most, what animals would be the less. And then we did our graph. And when they were done with that graph, they went back and they did their own individual graph. So the way that I assessed was I walked around, I checked their lists, I saw if they were sorting. We also could use in the lesson, if I was in the classroom at that time, I would have had baby plastic animals, and then they could have pulled in or actually brought up, here is a baby pig, here is a chicken, here is a horse, here is a donkey. But we just did the sorting that way. I looked at how their graph was, I looked at how their table was, so that is how I assessed how they did. And I could see if some students needed extra help or some students needed to go in a group. I also, when they came back, they actually, some of them I knew who could go in a graph and who helped each other. I had a para in the class, they could actually sit with them. So I also read that visual learning in the book was to engage students in effective practices in early childhood education. Says this is good for students with disabilities and dual language. So that was good about the song and all the motivational skills on the smartboard. The materials that we used were a smartboard, pencils, graphs, handout, crayons. We did our vocabulary words. For the higher order thinking, I had questions like, which has more? How do you know? Which has less? What is the graph telling you? So they can tell me that they can see that the pig has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that's why we have it in the graph. If they couldn't grasp that, I could actually just use the little the manipulatives that stick together, and they could count those at. They had the number lines on their desk. They could count that way too. When they were finished, for the students that could continue on, I had a whole bunch of handouts. Some of my handouts was how many people like the sheep best, how many people like the horses best, how many people like the pigs best, and then they would have to put in. And then they also could write, so you had some writing, which farm animal do most of the kids like best, and then they would have to write it, which farm animal do kids like the least, and then they would write that down. Like I said, for the students dual language and the children that had IEP and that needed help, they could work in groups, or they could also just cut out the pictures and put that on the graph. And for future lessons, I had more handouts like this one, and they would actually write the name, they could graph, and then they had to write the number. So that was good for extra work. So I just think that graphing is really good, and it's in their math lesson, so it was very hands-on. It got them very motivated, and there were so many different lessons that you can do with graphing. For the future, we can do foods. I had different lessons, foods. We could do future lessons, French fries, what do they like, cotton candy, ice cream, that could be in the future. The same thing to keep continuing doing the graphing. One of the problems that I think I did have was that I did too many animals. I don't know if it's confusing. I just had too many. I think maybe, especially for the students that had a hard time, maybe doing less. And it would just be easier to graph. I think this just takes a long time, especially if I read the story beforehand and we did all the stuff on the smartboard. But I think it's a good lesson, and I think the kids really enjoyed it, and I hope it was good. Thank you.